belli could be concocted. The two countries invaded Iraq anyway, proclaiming the single question. The most important raid of the pre-war war against Iraq was apparently on September 5, 2002, when U.S. and British planes flattened Saddam's airbase, called H-3, in Iraq's western desert. British journalist Ed Harriman reports. The raid had destroyed military communications and anti-aircraft defenses, as well as Iraqi planes, he notes, thus clearing the way for the planned invasion. 2 days later, Tony Blair arrived in Washington to visit Bush. At their joint press conference, Blair described the catalog of attempts by Iraq to conceal its weapons of mass destruction, not to tell the truth about it over not just a period of months, but over a period of years. Blair, while sincerely advising the driver of the motorcycle to follow the diplomatic route, knew full well that the war was already underway. All the while, the two leaders were making sure that state violence would be protected from scrutiny by Parliament, Congress, and the public in both countries. The plan for spikes of activity against Iraq to try to concoct a pretext for an invasion, described in a July 23, 2002 memo from Foreign Policy aide Matthew Rycroft to the British ambassador to the United States, David Manning, was the most important revelation of the Downing Street memos. The tactic is a venerable one. Psychological warfare specialists in the Eisenhower administration advised that the United States should covertly stimulate acts and attitudes of defiance short of mass rebellion aimed at provoking open Soviet intervention in both the GDR, East Germany, and the other satellites, advice that was secretly accepted by the U.S. government immediately after Soviet tanks crushed mass worker protests in East Berlin. Another example of this tactic is Israel's attacks on Lebanon in early 1982, seeking to provoke a response by the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, that could be used as a pretext for a planned invasion. Despite failure to elicit a credible pretext, in June 1982, Israel launched the invasion for the purpose of blocking PLO diplomatic efforts and ensuring Israeli control over the West Bank, while imposing a client regime in Lebanon. In yet another example, CIA-backed Kosovo Liberation Army guerrillas attacked civilian targets in Kosovo in early 1999. Openly announcing that they hoped the violence would provoke a harsh Serbian response that could then be used to arouse popular Western support for an attack on Serbia. It is possible that current U.S. military actions across Syria's borders are likewise designed to provoke some pretext for attack on the one Arab state that is currently defying Washington's orders. The ranking of priorities: terror and real interests. The conventional task of doctrinal managers is to protect power and those who wield it from scrutiny and, most important, to deflect analysis from their rational planning in pursuit of the real interests they serve. Discussion must be diverted instead to noble intent and self-defense, perhaps misguided. In the Iraq case, liberation of the suffering people of Iraq and defense of the United States against terror. It is therefore necessary to protect the doctrine that Iraq would have been selected for invasion even if the world's energy resources happened to be in Central Africa. As if that challenge were not difficult enough, others awaited, among them concealing the Western role in the dismal pre-war fate of Iraq, as well as the consequences of the U.S.-UK invasion, both in Iraq and worldwide, which are grim. There are further problems. To begin with, though it was anticipated that the invasion would probably enhance the threat of terror and proliferation, it may have done so even in unanticipated ways. It is common to say that claims about WMDs in Iraq were quickly undermined when, after an exhaustive search, no traces were found. That is not quite accurate, however. There were stores of equipment for developing WMDs in Iraq after the invasion, those produced in the 1980s thanks to aid provided by the United States and Britain, among others, aid that continued well after Saddam's worst atrocities and the end of the war with Iran. The aid included means for developing missiles and nuclear weapons, as well as virulent strains of anthrax and other biotoxins, the latter in apparent violation of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, BTWC, a serious breach of international law. The threat posed by these installations had been put forth as one reason for invading Iraq. These sites had been secured by UN inspectors, but the invaders dismissed them, leaving the sites unguarded. The immediate consequence was sophisticated and massive looting of these installations. The UN inspectors continued to carry out their work, relying on satellite imagery. By June 2005, they had discovered 109 sites that had been looted. Most looting was from production sites for solid and liquid propellant missiles, where about 85% of equipment had been removed, along with biotoxins and other materials usable for chemical and biological weapons, and high-precision equipment capable of making parts for nuclear and chemical weapons and missiles. A Jordanian journalist was informed by officials in charge of the Jordanian-Iraqi border after U.S. and U.K. forces took over that radioactive materials were detected in one of every 8 trucks crossing into Jordan, destination unknown. Stuff happens, in Rumsfeld's words. The ironies are almost inexpressible. The official justification for the invasion was to prevent the use of WMDs that did not exist. The invasion provided the terrorists who had been mobilized by the United States and its allies with the means to develop WMDs, namely, equipment that the United States and others had provided to Saddam Hussein, caring nothing about the terrible crimes they later evoked to whip up support for an invasion to overthrow him. It is as if Iran were now making nuclear weapons using fissionable materials provided by the United States to Iran under the Shah, which may indeed be happening, as Graham Allison points out. The Pentagon civilians in charge did make sure that certain other sites were protected, however, the oil and security ministries. Elsewhere, looting and destruction, including of irreplaceable treasures of civilization, proceeded unconstrained. 2 years after the invasion, the president of the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq, McGuire Gibson, sadly confirmed that Iraq is losing its culture and its wealth. By then, more than half the nation's archaeological sites, including most major Sumerian ones, had been destroyed. The Americans are not doing anything, Gibson added, though he acknowledged there was a little help from the Italian and Dutch contingents. The losses at these sites dwarfed even the massive looting of the National Museum shortly after U.S. troops arrived, in which at least 15,000 of the 20,000 looted pieces disappeared, probably forever. Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz and Company may even have succeeded in causing irreversible damage to Iraq's oil fields. To support the invasion, the fields are being driven to pump more than they should, which might lead to permanent decline in production. Recall the confident predictions that the liberation, greeted with flowers, would be self-financed by booming oil production. The invasion of Iraq is perhaps the most glaring example of the low priority assigned by Washington planners to the threat of terror, but there are numerous others. A case in point is Washington's imposition of new sanctions on Syria under the Syria Accountability Act, passed almost unanimously by Congress and signed into law by President Bush in late 2003. Syria is on the official list of states sponsoring terrorism, despite Washington's acknowledgement that Damascus has not been implicated in terrorist acts for many years. The true nature of Washington's concern over Syria's links to terror was revealed by President